I want to address the video African Americans Ain't African. The individual that was being interviewed for that particular video had three pertinent questions that he wanted to answer. Uh, Really, they was rhetorical questions because as individuals, we are supposed to ask those questions of ourselves. The first one was, where are the slave ships that brought millions of Africans to the Americas? Now, to me, the question is pretty straightforward, but for some reason, people interpreted it as him saying that the slave trade, or slavery for that matter, never happened. And that's not what he said. He just asked the question, where were the ships? Now, I have been to a great many museums and I've read a great many books concerning artifacts from different eras of time. And not one of those books or one of those museums had a slave ship in it. And I thought it was peculiar myself, being that the claim is millions of Africans was brought to the Americas this way within a 300-year period. So there should be some ships around for us as recipients of that story to examine. But yet there isn't any. So I understand that first question, and I did not interpret it as he was being flippant and saying that slavery didn't occur in North America, South America, or Central America. So my take on the matter is this. Just as he said, slavery couldn't have happened as we was told. Slavery could not have happened as it was told in the miniseries called Roots. Years later, we learned that the author of the book, Alex Haley, who also supposedly wrote the screenplay for the book called Roots, had plagiarized it. It was originally a novel written by a Caucasian, and he took it and put his name on it and maybe changed a few uh, characters' names, and he sold the book. And I believe he had a lot of help pushing that book because that book's agenda was to further push the so-called African American away from his original roots. You see, something happened when that miniseries came out. I remember it very clearly because I was about 12 years old when the miniseries came on television. And every day people rushed home so that they can watch that. And it was the conversation piece every day at school. And something had happened in the so-called African American community when that miniseries came out, because all of a sudden people started referring to themselves as African American. Before Roots, no one called themselves that. That was some Afro American, um, but no African American. Actually, on the farms, they still had black. They even had Negro still on the farms when you filled out forms that required you to give your ethnicity. But nowhere would you find African American. until after that miniseries. So I know it seems like I'm straying from the question of where are the ships. I'm really not, because I'm pointing out to you that there's some inconsistencies in this whole slavery thing. Because remember, the slavery story as we know it now did not occur until after the miniseries of Roots. People was not telling the slavery story like that until after Roots. So is it any wonder that we don't have any evidence, none, of the slave trade as it has been propagandized or propagandized to us as American blacks or the American indigenous? So again, I think the man have a good point with that question. And if people would just push aside their egos and just think about it, it wouldn't make any sense to them either. Even the most illogical person would find fault with there are no ships. People suggested that the ships had rotted away. Well, if the paddle boats that sat at the bottom of the Mississippi didn't rot away, I kind of figured slave ships wouldn't rot away either. His second question was, what African nation is claiming African Americans as their enslaved descendants? And to my knowledge, none. Maybe Africans have changed their perceptions of a pure bloodline, but the Africans I met, it was very important for them to maintain their bloodline, because in maintaining their bloodline, they're honoring their ancestors. So I don't see any African nation stepping to the plate saying that so-called African Americans are their people. Because when you talk to the Africans, now I've talked to a great many, especially when I was in college, they would tell you that African Americans are not seen in a positive light in Nigeria or in Ghana or in Somalia. They're not seen in a positive light. They see us as nonchalant, uncaring, dumb, lazy people. Yes, they look at some of our athletes, entertainers, and politicians with admiration. But that's not how they see the average so-called African American. Even though in the 80s, when South Africa had their apartheid taking place, and the so-called African American rallied to their defense, they didn't change their view of us. How many times have they rallied to so-called African Americans' aid? None. So right there should tell you that they have no connections to you. We can call ourselves all kinds of African this and African that if we want, but it won't change the fact that even they know who you are. They don't have respect for you for that reason, that you don't know who you are. You don't even know that you're standing on your own land. So no matter what we call ourselves African American all day long, but the Africans will be the first ones to tell you you're not African. The gentleman's third question, he wanted to know, what did Martin Luther King mean when he said 100 years later the American Negro is exiled? in his own land. Out of all the comments that was written underneath that video, not one person addressed that. And I figured the reason they didn't address it is because they couldn't. What he said was to the point. There is no misunderstanding that statement. I don't think it was a slip of a tongue when he made the statement. I believe at that time that was one of his final speeches, and he was starting to backpedal on his integration beliefs. So he put that tidbit in there, and it went over people's heads. Even though those people at that time, they were still referring to themselves as Indians. So something happened. And I think what happened was in 1975 when Roots came out. That's when people started calling themselves African American. That's when they literally took themselves from this land and put themselves elsewhere. That's a shame. It's an absolute shame, because this is your home. And if you truly believe you're African, as the man said, I think his name is Indigenous One, go to Africa and tell them that you're their lost descendants, and see what they tell you. You're going to get a rude awakening. They don't want you because you're not of their bloodline. That's very important to them. The nasty remarks that were left in the comments section of African Americans Ain't African video. It's terrible. Very bad, because here you have someone who stepped outside to tell you about yourself. He didn't have to. Actually, there are quite a few of our people who know the truth. They keep it to themselves. They keep it to themselves. They prey on you. People like Jesse Jackson, he know the truth, but you know what he's been doing? He's been upholding the lie. He made a statement a while back. He said that 60 million Africans died in the Middle Passage to the Americas. Do you realize how many people that is? Do you realize how many people was in Africa at that time? In the 1800s, I think Africa had, let me think here, 90 million people. 90 million people in the 1800s. So if they took 60 million out, do you see where I'm going with this? Those numbers not making any sense. But yet, Jesse Jackson made that statement, and not one person called him on it, made him explain that, which he wouldn't been able to. The 1500s to the 1800s, they lacked the technology to haul that many people from one landmass to another. And remember, it took them 3 to 4 months just to get from West Africa to the Caribbean. Okay? So during that 3 or 4 months, you had so-called 300 people lined up at the bottom of the ship, the very area where, under normal circumstances, the crew will have to store all of their food and water. And remember, it took up all of that space to store the food and water for the crew who maintained the ship. But if you have 300 people down there, where are you going to keep the food and water for not just the crew, but those people who are captive at the bottom of the ship. It don't make any sense. And again, like I said, the technology that they had during the time of the slave trade, which was supposed to be 300 years from 1500s to the 1800s, those ships just couldn't haul that many people. They couldn't. I don't care how you cram people in. And there's no way that you can take healthy people for 3 to 4 months, don't give them any food or water. They lying still in their defecation, vomit, menstrual blood, uh, people dying next to them. And they survive all of that 3 to 4 months in a dark bottom of a ship. It makes no sense. And like I said, nobody made Jesse Jackson explain how that could be. You have people commenting saying pretty much the same thing, and they don't take into consideration that there are certain needs that you have to have for on your journey. You need water, you need food, and you need movement. Our lymphatic system is just like our circulatory system. But the difference is we don't have organs that move the fluids around in our body within the lymphatic system. What moves the fluids around in the lymphatic system is us moving. That's why if you ever worked in a hospital, you know that certain patients who can't move themselves, who can't change their position, they have to be turned every so many hours. Every so many. Otherwise, they would die. They would suffocate in their own fluids. You have to constantly move them every so many hours. So here you have a slave ship of people who not only don't have any food and water, and if they got any food and water, it was inadequate, but they can't move. So right there tells you that they didn't get any food and water. That tells you that this whole story was made up. Made up. And people are still regurgitating it. And would get mad when you don't share that belief with them. So the gentleman in the video is on point when he said that we must learn to question, use our brains, stop assuming that people have our best interests when they don't. Now, I have a theory. My theory is, and I recall reading something similar to it. It's simply saying that the so-called slaves, and believe me, it wasn't as many as folks like to believe, but nonetheless, that's a whole nother issue, were the indigenous people here. And when they start reclassifying us, that's where people got lost. They start calling you African when in reality you was indigenous. And I read somewhere where what they would do, they would go to the tribes, they would take the children on a boat, take them across the Mississippi and tell them they were from Africa. And the little children, being that they're children, they believed. And I believe that's where all of this slave stuff came from. Is they did the technology. They did not have the technology to bring masses of people from Africa. They just didn't have it, and there's no sense in us pretending that they did. And when people start arguing about that, you know right away that these people did not do any research whatsoever, and they're not exercising any common sense.